Thank you, Valerie. I want to first just acknowledge my co-authors, John Speed Myers and Shani Buggs, who played very important roles in putting together this paper and presentation. Um, I'm going to show you a lot of pictures because I think pictures stay with people a little bit longer than the words. And I'm going to start with this one. This is the age-specific homicide offending rate based upon data from the supplemental homicide report from the UCR. It's strikes quite striking, the rate at which homicide offending goes up so rapidly during adolescence and then drops off into the 20s. If I showed you a similar curve for many other violent crimes like aggravated assault, robbery in particular, it wouldn't look all that different. I recognize this is sort of risky that I'm going to start talking about the adolescent brains, as I have absolutely no medical background whatsoever, and I'm at the Institute of Medicine here. But I'll just simply to say that it's well known that our brains really aren't fully developed during adolescence. Critical things are going on, particularly with the prefrontal cortex and its development, which is very important in terms of impulse control, understanding consequences, a variety of really critical functions that come into play in a lot of issues in interpersonal relationships. There are also, of course, important hormonal changes going on during puberty. And these types of changes under stress and high emotion leads to a lot of risk-taking. Now, the reason for the curve that I first showed you isn't obviously purely a biological phenomenon. The vast majority of adolescents, of course, don't commit these serious acts of violence. And the adolescent brain development issues come into play and are far more important in a more what is referred to as criminogenic risky environments. And that is where guns come into play, where all of these issues make lethal consequences from very impulsive acts going on. There's a very broad literature looking at the relationship between firearm availability and risk of a variety of kinds of deaths, including homicide, suicide, and unintentional firearm deaths. Much of that work, of course, has been done by David Hemingway, Matt Miller, Deb Asriel, and colleagues at Harvard. Here are a couple of papers published close in time looking at an independent variable of prevalence of gun ownership in states in relationship to risk for homicide and suicide. It's remarkably similar, the relationship, the elevated risk with a 1% higher rate of gun ownership leading to much higher rate of firearm homicide risk, suicide risk, and overall risk for homicide and suicides. Of course, those measures were more in an aggregate environment. The closer the guns are to young people at risk, of course, the greater the risk. Within the home, there's a variety of studies that examined the relationship between gun ownership and suicide risk to adolescents, showing really incredibly elevated risk, 5 to 10-fold in some cases. It's a little more challenging to, particularly in the adolescent context, look at most proximate access to guns. So you can look at this in a variety of ways. One striking study, to me anyway, led by Dr. Richard Burke at University of Pennsylvania, looked at individuals on parole and probation and what were the factors that were most predictive of who would go on to commit murder or attempted murder. The number of prior gun charges, illegal possession of guns, was one of the best predictors for that outcome. I'm going to now walk you through a few noteworthy trends. This looks at the firearm homicide rate in red here and the firearm suicide rate. It looks like the slides changed my color. That white is the suicide rates. Basically, what you see here is a very dramatic decline in both of these causes of death that peaked in the early 1990s, declined rapidly up until around 2000, have been relatively stable until very recently, and this is something, of course, we'll want to pay attention to see whether these are just fluctuations or the beginnings of trends. But I'm encouraged by a beginning of a bending of that curve down for homicides, but concerned about the potential for increase for firearm suicide rates for adolescents. Juvenile arrests for murder and non-negligent manslaughter show a very similar pattern than what I just showed you with victimization. And there's no perfect way, nothing close to a perfect way to actually measure youth gun carrying practices. One, of course, is the rate at which juveniles are arrested for gun offenses. This, of course, is function not only of juvenile gun carrying, but also of law enforcement practices. But again, we see a somewhat similar pattern here with a noteworthy decline in recent years that perhaps might have something to do with the beginning downward trend for arrests for murders for juveniles. Now, the other national level data that we can look to look at patterns for adolescent gun carrying come from the CDC's youth risk behavior surveillance system. Here again, I'm showing you the pattern for males because gun carrying is very much a male phenomenon, perhaps not surprising to anyone. Again, you see very noteworthy declines, particularly for black males during this period where homicide victimization and perpetration were declining so rapidly, and some similar more recent trends with an uptick for African American males around 2007, 2009. So what's going on more broadly within with guns in the homes of children and adolescents? This is a longer-term trend from the General Social Survey's measure of firearm ownership within homes. But again, these patterns look incredibly similar to what you see for adolescent suicide rates, with again a recent very large declines during the 90s, and then beginning an uptick after noteworthy declines. So how do youth who perpetrate crimes of violence with guns get their guns? Difficult thing to measure. One national measure that you can look to is their national surveys of people incarcerated in state prisons. And we've looked at those data for individuals who committed crimes with firearms and did so at a young age. So here I show you two columns, one for juveniles, those under 18 and those 18 to 20 years old. What's very common for both of these is that the most common way in which they are getting their guns is through this so-called street or underground market. I don't know about you, but to me that is very frustrating because I'm not sure exactly what that means. You get it on the street or an underground market, but I'll get into that in just a moment. But of course, friends and family members also were key in their ability to access firearms. There had been a lot of debate, particularly when we get into policy discussions about the importance of theft. There are some individuals who will claim that the vast majority of criminals, including youth, obtain their weapons through by stealing them, and therefore regulating sales is rather irrelevant. That doesn't seem to hold water with the data I'm showing you here. We did a very small scale but very in-depth study of juveniles incarcerated in Maryland, and particularly those involved with guns, and asked them questions about how they obtain firearms. We found, and we also wanted to know, in essence, how you got initiated into having a gun in a more criminal context. That is very important from a prevention standpoint, as well as the most recent time that occurred. So again, what's interesting to me, again, this is a very small sample, but family played a very important role early on for the initial acquisition. But later on, in the most recent acquisitions, far more common were acquaintances, friends, family members. And when we did these interviews, I then got a little better sense of sort of what it meant to get it on the street. Typically, that did not mean some random stranger person on the street, but it typically meant someone who maybe they're not friends with, but there is somebody who said, yes, you can trust them. So that's important as we go forward here. Drug addicts were a source later on as well. What about the method of acquisition? This was one surprising finding for the first acquisition, that we found that a healthy proportion, almost a quarter of the first acquisitions were, they reported finding them. And this actually connects to the, what I'm trying to do in my paper and in this presentation is sort of look at two issues. One is acquisition and the other is carrying. On the carrying side, what we learned is that quite commonly, when they thought police were there and the last thing they wanted to do is be caught with a gun, they would throw their gun someplace, maybe in the weeds, in an alley or something like that. And many of the young people will pay attention to that and then go and pick up those guns and find them later. Many of them were getting them as gifts from uncles, things of that nature, who thought they needed them for protection. But again, as the adolescents got a little bit older, that more commonly they were purchasing their firearms. A much larger in-depth examination of the underground gun market was a very large study in Chicago published in 2007, led by Phil Cook and his colleagues. More in-depth work of that nature is now going on both in Chicago and many other cities. But part of that work, they did interview 75 young gang members as well as 190 non-gang but high-risk youth ages 18 to 21. Those who were in gangs commonly acquired their guns through gangs, and one important and interesting finding was that the gang leaders, in essence, rationed the gun. They did not want all gang members running around with guns, particularly the young ones, because they actually did not want gun violence occurring because it threatened their business and as well as their safety. Another important finding was very significant search cost of trying to find a gun in this underground gun market for many individuals. There's a sort of a belief that in many contexts, in many inner cities, all you have to do is just kind of go out and it's a piece of cake to find a gun. That was not the case in Chicago. Of course, Chicago at that time of the study had a broad ban of guns. Nevertheless, what was important is that, again, just as we found in Maryland, they would not acquire a gun just from any individual. They needed a trusted supplier. This added substantially to transaction cost. And ultimately, the prices of guns for very low-quality guns were about 3 to 4 times higher than what you would be able to get in the legal market. Now, the other source of information about this underground gun market comes from closer points of diversion. The surveys will typically just tell you this is how they immediately, their most proximal access to a gun, but again, sometimes those guns may have spent a while in an underground market context. And so trafficking investigations are one source of information, as well as crime gun traces. What that information tells us is that illegal straw purchases, those people purchasing guns for prohibited persons, corrupt gun dealers, and individuals who sell a lot of guns for profit but don't bother to actually get a license, so that they would actually have to do background checks and record keeping. Those were all key important channels for diverting guns into the illicit market. Now, the research on this comes from cases back from the 1990s. Now, of course, we have a potentially very different environment with internet sales. And here is very little trouble to find private sellers who advertise. And it's known, of course, that in most states, private sales means no background checks, no record keeping. I'm just going to mention this very briefly. Want to touch upon some studies about preventing diversion into this illicit market where youth most commonly get their guns. We've conducted a couple of studies looking at a few large cities when they identified the problematic gun dealers, did undercover stings, and then sued those gun dealers who made blatantly illegal sales. And in each case, we found fairly dramatic reductions in the diversions of guns to criminals following these interventions based upon gun trace data. We've also published a couple of studies that look at the association between state firearm sales policies and measures of diversions, both within state and across state lines. What we find is that regulating all transactions involving handguns, that means with private sellers as well, is protective against the diversion of guns to criminals, particularly in the most robust permit-to-purchase systems that I can talk about later if we have a little more time. I'll touch upon some other research on this in just a moment. Strong gun dealer regulations on the books, but importantly, actually being used, were very important within state diversions. And in more recent studies looking at across state line diversions, mandatory theft and loss reporting for gun owners was protective against diversions. I don't have a slide. There is a recent study published in Injury Prevention by Glenn Pierce, Anthony Braga, and Garen Wintemute, finds very similar types of findings of what I just showed here. In particular, how strong a set of laws and policies in place in California have been in preventing diversions of guns to criminals. One of the more recent important policy changes that's enabled us to do some research, but perhaps to the detriment of the citizens of Missouri, is when lawmakers in that state repealed its permit-to-purchase handgun law effective in August 28, 2007. This is a mechanism by which they regulated all handgun sales, including private transactions. So what we found is these bars represent the interval between a sale and involvement in crime. What we found is following the repeal, roughly a twofold increase in the measures of diversion that lined up pretty much perfectly with when the repeal went into place. We also noted a rather sharp change in the ratio of guns that criminals were using that had originated within sales within the state of Missouri as opposed to out of state. Most importantly for public safety, we found significant changes associated with this law with lethal violence. This graph shows you the murder rate in Missouri with the yellow line juxtaposed with the murder rate for the nation. So at the same time, our national rates for murder were going down, Missouri's was spiking up. We did a fairly extensive analysis to rule out a variety of alternative explanations for this aberrant trend in Missouri, and ruled out a variety of those alternative explanations. Our estimates were that the firearm homicide rate over more than 3 years, first 3 and a third years, a 25% increase in firearm homicide rates, no change associated with the policy change for homicides committed by other means, and over a longer period using FBI data, a 14% increase in murders. Again, we saw these increases throughout the state. This was not some local phenomenon going on that might be explained by other reasons. Now, the data I just showed you have been published earlier this year, but I took a look for purposes of this meeting to look at the type of changes that were specific to youth. And here I'm showing you the percentage change in firearm homicide rates for youth ages 14 to 17 before and after the law changed. The permit to purchase handgun law was repealed in Missouri. A 13% increase for youth victimization in that state. At the same time, a 13% decline nationally for this age group. If you look at the states surrounding Missouri with the most population, you'll see some rather noteworthy declines going on. So this, what was going on for youth victimization in Missouri was not at all a regional phenomenon. More recently, and unpublished right now, we've looked at a similar type of policy and its effect when it was introduced in the state of Connecticut in 1995. Using a synthetic control procedure, we've estimated that the policy was associated with a 40% reduction in firearm homicide rates with no change in non-firearm, non-gun homicide rates. What about youth-specific strategies, youth-specific firearm policies? A study that I published a decade ago with colleagues in JAMA, we looked at a variety of youth restrictions for firearms and their impact on adolescent suicide rates. We found the only policy that was protective was safe storage laws, or so-called child access prevention laws associated with a 9% reduction in teen suicide rates. There's been relatively little research looking at other youth-focused restriction policies. Marvel published one study looking at juvenile bans of handgun possession and found no effect from that policy. However, I think it's worth noting that really there was no meaningful legal change, in my opinion, because if you were 16 or 17-year-old and caught with a handgun, you could still be charged in almost all contexts for carrying a gun in public without a permit. So I think there's more work to be done in this area. I want to jump forward to ways to discourage illegal gun carrying, since this is particularly important for youth. So I'm going to talk about two general strategies that have some similarities and some important differences. One is specialized police units that focus on where shootings are most common, where and when they're most common, deployed to look for signs of illegal carrying and make arrests accordingly. A number of cities have done this, and evaluations have found consistent reductions in shootings in those areas, anywhere from 29% to 71%. In our own study that I mentioned before of juveniles incarcerated in Maryland, it was the most common reason. Their awareness of these patrols was their reason for not carrying. That came up time and time again in our conversations. The question, of course, right now, importantly, is can this be done legally and fairly? I want to make clear there's important distinctions between very focused, specialized units and much broader stop and frisk policies of the type that had been in place in New York City for a long time. Um, Another strategy is the focused deterrence strategy developed and refined over years by David Kennedy and colleagues. Here it's a much more focused approach on individuals and using a combined law enforcement criminal justice lever to basically say you can't use guns, you can't carry guns, you and your associates, communicating those risks directly to them. Importantly, and this is, I think, becoming a bigger part of the intervention, is the informal social controls part of it, the individuals who they trust, who will get to them to get them to put down the guns. There have been a number of studies looking at this intervention and consistently shown very large reductions in violence. So I think in conclusion, they're reducing unsupervised access to firearms will save lives. We have effective policies both on the demand side and the supply side. Deterring illegal gun carrying should be a focus of law enforcement, but in close collaboration with community.